Right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to start off with module 39. So we got into this a little bit in terms of talking about kind of conceptually what a psychological disorder is. We'll do some evaluation of psychological disorders. So we're going to start here, and again, I'm going to try to move us away from the PowerPoint slides, but to get us going here, we'll start at least a little bit with this. We'll try to do a couple of different things. Hopefully the poll works, a little bit of video clips, stuff like that. So we'll try to break things up a little bit. Again, if you do have a video camera, please turn it on. It really is great to see you guys. It makes it a lot more fun experience, hopefully for you as well. So what I want to do is take care of a couple of quick announcements. So the first is that all grading is officially up to date. So I've got everything graded, the quizzes, the module outlines, things like that. I don't have a class by the numbers, but I think we'll forego that just to keep things moving here. With that being said, for this class, you can always calculate your grade to know where you stand by simply taking the current total points that you have and dividing that by the total number of points you've accumulated. Okay, so if you're interested in kind of checking where you're at grade-wise now, you can take the total points that you've earned, and the current points that it's out of is 480. Okay, so you can see how we're closing in on the last bit here. We've got a module outline, a quiz, an exam, and then your research credits are left. So we're starting to close in. So if you want to calculate your current grade after lecture, you can do that. Simply take your total points you've earned divided by 480. Again, you can do this at any point during the class, regardless of kind of where we're at. Just take your total points you've earned over the total points in the class. In terms of announcements too, quiz number 5 is now posted. So actually, I think it'll be posted after class officially. It's due before our last class on April 23rd. So keep that in mind. The module outline, the quiz, again, is due before our last day of class on the 23rd. You'll see that for this quiz, it's gone back to the typical format of multiple choice. But make sure that you're spending some time with that. You can get that done now if you want to. Also, make sure that you're completing your research credits. Okay, so one of the benefits for you guys, though, with this pandemic is that we have been able to take a lot of the research credits and put them online. So I made a point of getting a study up and available to you guys as well. So really looking at things, with the exception of the exam, you can wrap things up in the class. You can do your module outline, you can do the quiz, get your research credits completed, work on all that, try to get that done so that especially as you get into finals week, you're only working on your last exams. And especially given how hard it is with taking the exams, how they're a little bit tricky, definitely try to make it that you're really just kind of focused on preparing for exams and being ready to go. So I know I'm starting to get a little bit more prepared for kind of wrapping things up, making sure things are in good shape with wrapping up. So that's all I really had for announcements, but let me pause at this point to see if there's questions, things that I can help you with. Hopefully you guys have turned on the coffee ambient noise and kind of imagine being in a coffee house. I even bust out my Ohio State coffee mug, which I promise is there someplace if I can get it right. So, and you guys know there's no coffee in this because I'm not a coffee drinker. I failed in that regard, but so jump in with things. Any questions, things I can answer for you guys? All right, so let's go ahead, and if something comes up, just let me know. Okay? Let's go ahead and get back to kind of where we left off last Thursday. And where we left off is talking about psychological disorders. So this is our next content area we focus on. And we're see how these psychological disorders are going to be tied to different personality traits. And so when we talk about psychological disorders, we're talking about it as a significant dysfunction in an individual's cognitions, emotions, or behaviors. Okay, so again, we'll talk about how we're going to define a significant dysfunction. What does that mean? But we can focus on, again, an individual's cognitions are their thought patterns. So the way that they process information in their head, the way they evaluate situations, their emotions in terms of their affective response, so their mood, how they're reacting specifically with their emotions to a situation, and their behaviors. Are they doing behaviors that are harmful to themselves potentially? And where we were really kind of focusing when we left off was talking about how disorders are diagnosed when there's considered a dysfunction. Okay? And disorders are diagnosed when there's a dysfunction in the sense that behaviors which are considered maladaptive start to interfere with daily life. Okay, so many of the behaviors we do may be adaptive to some degree, such as checking to make sure doors are locked, things like that. But when they start to interfere with your daily life, keep you from doing the things that you need to, harming your ability to stay on time, to stay focused, that's where you might start to argue that they become dysfunctional. The other piece that we've talked about so far is that disorders are diagnosed when there's distress experienced. Okay, so is there some kind of suffering? Is the person feeling worse? Is it causing them to feel like anxiety and stress, we start to talk about those as disorders. Okay, so now they're starting to cause problems for that person. And the DSM-5, which we'll talk more about, but this is kind of the guidebook for diagnosing disorders, says the definition of a psychological disorder is a disturbance in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. Okay, so this is really focused on that mental functioning, the person's cognitions, their emotions, and how there might be psychological reasons. Okay? Biological, so this is the first time we start to see biology being introduced into understanding dysfunctions. And we also see too this is related to developmental, so especially as kids progress through, are they going through each of the stages successfully, or are they having difficulties as they progress through each of the stages? Okay. Now, we reviewed this a bit before, and what I want us to do is start thinking about how we diagnose, how we work with psychological disorders based on these definitions. Okay, so I'm going to kind of present this challenge to you. So what we're going to do is we'll go through maybe 2 or 3 scenarios, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to break you guys into small groups, and I want you to decide if you think the person has a psychological disorder or not. Okay, thinking about the criteria we just talked about. Okay, so here's our first person. Again, what I'll do is I'll read this to you guys. You can kind of take notes. If you have the slides someplace else, you can refer back to these. We'll go through it, and then I'll break you guys into smaller groups so you can discuss if this person has a psychological disorder. And then hopefully this time our poll will work, and we'll see based on polling if you think this person has a psychological disorder. Okay, so here's the story of Andrew. So Andrew has led a turbulent life. As a young child, he skipped school more often than he attended. When he did attend, he was a frequent behavior problem, often getting into fights with other boys. He was finally expelled from school altogether after stabbing another student in his high school class. Since then, he has not held a job for any length of time. Soon after his expulsion, he began supplementing his income by breaking into homes and stealing whatever he could get his hands on. However, he appears to feel no guilt about his behavior. Although he has never been in a committed relationship, he has several children who he never sees, due partly to the fact he frequently moves from town to town. Despite these characteristics, Andrew is a colorful and entertaining person and has a certain charm. If asked, he will tell you that he's quite happy with his current lifestyle. Okay? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and break you into groups. Okay, so we did this once before. I'll break you into small groups. And what I want you to do is spend just a minute or two discussing with your group if you think or not that Andrew has a psychological disorder based on what we were talking about. Okay, so I'll go ahead and break you into groups here. Here we go. All right, so we'll get everyone back here in just a second. All right, so now that we have everyone back, okay, share with me where you thought that Andrew does have a psychological disorder. So what were some pieces of information that caused you to lean towards believing that Andrew does have a psychological disorder? Okay, so hopefully in your groups you're kind of thinking about where Andrew does or doesn't have a psychological disorder, what aspects of his life, led you one way or other. Where did you see that he does have a psychological disorder? Okay, so we got one response. He started turning to crime to supplement what he was missing. So you can see that that's a problematic behavior. Okay, it's aversive to him and others. Okay, so great response. Okay, so what are some other pieces of evidence evaluating Andrew where it's diagnosed him as having a psychological disorder? Okay, so it's interesting to think about the fact that he doesn't feel guilt about this. Okay, so I had someone tell me guilt was a worthless emotion once. And I thought about that and I said, no, guilt's really important. It helps you correct your behavior. It helps you understand when you maybe harm someone else. Okay, you can make sure that you correct your behaviors. Okay, so maybe another piece where you'd say that Andrew does have a psychological disorder. Okay, so let's get one other piece of evidence because I think there's a lot of different ways that you can evaluate this scenario.
They say that he has many children, but doesn't see them a lot, and had many relationships, but not like a committed one. So
Okay.
maybe that's like proof that like he can't like form relationships and like stuff like that.
Okay, so it's I think it's a great response. Okay, I think it shows again how he has problematic behavior. That it's important to have relationships with others, to have that connection with others. It's important to take care of your children. It's an important role that you have to play. And you see that he's not interested in doing that. He's not able to maintain that well. Okay, so great evidence for where you'd say he does have a psychological disorder. What were some aspects of it that you thought indicated he doesn't have a psychological disorder? Okay, so let's get two aspects where you think maybe if you look at this, you say, no, it's not really a psychological disorder.
They say that he's a colorful and entertaining person with like certain charms. So obviously like he's not always in like that quote unquote like evil mindset, stabbing people and all that. Like he can act normal.
Okay, so he sounds like he could be rather pleasant. I think it's a great observation. Seems like he's functional in the sense that he's able to be sociable. That others may very well like him. Okay, especially because of his charm. So maybe it isn't a dysfunction for him. Okay, let's get another piece of evidence building on what Ronnie's saying in terms of why they might not see him as having a psychological disorder.
So he says that. Oh, you can go.
Oh, sorry. It says that he was this kind of is far-fetched, but that he was kicked out of high school and couldn't really hold a job for a long extended period of time. So like the stealing might be coming from personal need.
Okay. All right, so maybe it's not a good diagnostic criteria. I think that's a great observation that really it's coming out of need, not because of a disregard for other people's property or selfishness or other things you might say is problematic. So great response. Okay. I think there was another response. I know it's tricky to not over talk each other when we're doing it this way.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, if you asked him, he said he's like happy with his current lifestyle. So that could be like disorders are diagnosed when symptoms and behaviors are accompanied by distress or suffering. He's not necessarily feeling the stress or suffering, but you could also argue his actions maybe show that he is. So maybe a weird gray space there, but.
And I think he really tapped in. I love that last comment from Leah. It really taps into this concern or this idea that he doesn't feel bad about it, but his behaviors are problematic, right? And so really kind of makes it unclear as to how you would respond to him and how you might diagnose him because of that kind of aspect. So what I want to do is I'm going to launch a poll. Go ahead and tell me if you think he has a psychological disorder or not. Okay, so let's get everyone to vote based on kind of what you're thinking about. Do you think he has a psychological disorder or not? Again, you presented evidence for both cases very well. Okay, we'll get the last couple of votes in. Okay, give you about 15 more seconds to go ahead and get your vote in if you haven't already. Love the votes. Love you guys jumping in. All right, so as you're seeing here, hopefully, we saw about exactly a third of the class said that, in fact, he does have a psychological disorder. Okay? And so I think it's interesting, this is, in the general direction that he has a disorder, but there's not by any means a consensus on this. Okay? So this is where it starts to get a difficulty of diagnosing whether someone has this disorder or not. Okay? We're going to do it one more time for one other person. We'll try to do this one a little bit quicker, okay? But I want us to practice with this one more time. All right, so let's talk about Diane. Okay? Diane is the only child of 2 professional parents. She did well in high school and has several close friends. However, her grades suffered when she got into college, and she spent 1 semester on probation before she graduated. While in college, she met Don, and the 2 married soon after graduation and 2 children of their own. Diane and Don decided that she would stay home until the children were in school, since his job was a prestigious accounting firm would allow him to support the family. 3 months ago, Don came home from work and announced that he met another woman and was having an affair and that he decided to leave Diane. Their divorce proceeded quickly, and while Diane retained custody of the children, she had to move to a smaller apartment. She began looking for work, but found that it was difficult to find a job. Eventually, she took a job that she disliked. Diane often finds herself thinking about how quickly her life has changed in the past few months. She becomes very sad and will sometimes lie in bed crying after her children are asleep. She finds herself eating a lot more than she used to, and sometimes she has difficulty getting to sleep. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and break you guys into groups again. Okay? And we'll go ahead and evaluate it, think about both sides of it, where she does have a disorder, where she doesn't, and then we'll do kind of the same process again. Okay, so here we go with breaking back into rooms again. All right, wait just a little bit to get the last of the group in. All right, so now that we have everyone back, what was some evidence that you found in your group discussions for why Diane does have a psychological disorder? Okay, and let's kind of work through this quickly. So share with me just kind of two pieces where you thought Diane does have a psychological disorder, where some symptoms seem to be present.
When it said that she couldn't sleep and she eats more than usual.
Okay. All right, so sleep patterns and eating patterns are oftentimes used by therapists and psychiatrists to diagnose if there's some type of disorder going on. Those type of behaviors are consistent with a number of disorders. So that's a good thing to pick up on. And we'll talk about sleep and eating related to different psychological disorders quite a bit. Okay, so great one. Let's get a second one. Okay, so you can jump in over audio. You can type something out in chat. What's the second situation or symptom where you see her as having a psychological disorder?
She's always thinking about, she's often thinking about how quickly her life has changed. Kind
Okay,
of,
so,
stuck in there rather than thinking about the now and the future and her family.
okay, so I love that. Again, her focus, especially her cognitions, when we talk about cognitions being an important piece, are all kind of focused back. Okay, and so how she's lost things. She's not really having that forward focus that's important for her. So that's a great response. Okay, what's maybe a point or two where we see that you'd argue she doesn't have a psychological disorder?
So she did go through a major divorce and a life-changing thing. So it could just, because after a divorce, you're probably expected to have some downside to it, especially since she stayed at home and took care of the kids, and now she has to go out, find a job, as well as deal with the moving, as well as dealing with the divorce, which is going to be a whole bunch of changes that are really big and probably cause some, which isn't probably a real word, but like after divorce depression, which is probably to be expected.
Okay. All right, so I think that's a great analysis for why you might say she doesn't have a psychological disorder. If all these things happen to you, wouldn't you feel that exact same way as well? I mean, especially considering how much she had invested in helping Dawn be successful while she was at home with the kids. This is a huge life-changing event. Would you not have some type of psychological difficulties that come along with this? I think that's the argument that you can make for why she wouldn't have a psychological disorder. Okay, so let's put it to a vote. Let's go ahead and open up our poll. And what I want you to do is indicate, do you think she has a psychological disorder or not? Okay, so you guys about a minute to chime in with your responses. All right, we'll close up voting here in about 10 seconds. So hopefully you guys can see the results. You see in this case, we had about 60% of the class that no, she doesn't have a psychological disorder, while 40% said that she does. Okay, so now we see kind of a little bit of flip from where we saw before, where the majority of the group saw that Andrew had a psychological disorder, but you're saying Diane doesn't. I think you presented a good argument in terms of what Ellie said for why there's a case she doesn't have a psychological disorder, but I also think that you can make the argument that she does. Okay? So what I want to do is kind of unpack this a bit more. There is one other example. You guys can work through this and kind of practice with it. Okay? But what I want to do is kind of get into understanding more of the kind of the nature of these psychological disorders. Okay? And so here's where I'm going to move away from having the slides being presented. So I'm going to stop presenting slides, but go ahead and make sure that you have these available to you, okay, so that you can kind of keep track of it. But I want to, again, kind of connect with you a bit more. You can make sure that you have your coffee sounds going on in the background. Kind of imagine kind of interacting a little more as we go through this. So when we think about psychological disorders, okay, one of the things we have to do is kind of start thinking about, well, what do we want to do with understanding these? Okay, so one of the first questions I want to pose to you guys is, why would it be helpful to diagnose a disorder? Okay, so what's the benefits of telling someone that they have a psychological disorder? Okay, or diagnosing others as having a psychological disorder? What benefits do we have in terms of doing this?
If the disorder is disruptive to their lifestyle, it might be able to get them some help so that they can get back on track or maybe improve the life they're living.
Okay, so perfect. I love that. So if they're diagnosed with the disorder, it may then help them be more successful in terms of improving their lives, being able to make changes, especially now that they have potentially a little bit more information. Okay, so great explanation. Why else would it be helpful to have a diagnosis?
You can become more aware of what it looks like, so you can be more prone to seeing it in other people or something.
Okay, so I lost you a little bit there, but it seems like you're kind of saying that by having that diagnosis, you know a little bit more what it looks like, maybe both in terms of a larger group, but also potentially in terms of how you feel as the individual maybe with that disorder, kind of the things to look for symptoms. Other thoughts is why it'd be helpful to have a diagnosis of a disorder.
It could be used to for a court case.
Okay, all right. So you can see that it'll be involved in both legal matters and in terms of insurance. So we'll talk a little bit about that here in a moment. Okay. One of the biggest reasons you guys hinted at this right away, along with the others that you presented, is that it's helpful to have a diagnosis because then it allows you to make decisions about how you're going to treat the problem. Okay, so we'll see that once a diagnosis occurs, that then starts to open up different ways that we can treat that disorder, different options. And no one particular option is perfect for everyone, but it gives us a chance to kind of think about maybe a different eclectic approach. We can start kind of putting multiple approaches together to try to help that person, to kind of tailor it to that particular person. Now, it's especially helpful because when we diagnose a disorder, it starts to provide treatment. And originally, the treatment for these psychological disorders were quite horrific. Okay, they're quite inhumane. So based on old understanding of psychological disorders, we saw the treatments as including exorcising evil spirits, beating, caging, restraints, all kinds of really abusive behaviors, including drilling through the person's skull. And the idea originally with psychological disorders, we saw individuals behaving in erratic ways that didn't make any sense, is that people thought that they were possessed by demonic, demonic demons or something religiously wrong with them. And so what they would do is they try to get these demons out of the person, which included drilling through their skull so they could release those spirits, release whatever was in the brain causing problems. Okay? Maybe potentially beating that person, trying to beat the evil spirit out. And this was a strategy for quite some time in terms of trying to manage psychological disorders. And in fact, it was kind of, unfortunately, reinforcing. And it was reinforcing to the extent that if they drilled a hole through a poor patient's skull, that person did start to become more calm afterwards. But the reason why that person was becoming more calm afterwards is because you've now injured their brain. So now they're not able to function. So it wasn't that you cured the problem. You basically replaced it with a different problem, okay? One that maybe made them more subdued, making it seem like it was successful. Now, this strategy was the approach towards addressing psychological disorders until Philippe Pinel introduced a different idea. He said rather than trying to treat psychological disorders by introducing more stress and more harm, he said, well, what if we start to treat them with kind of more care and concern? Okay? So he suggested, okay, instead, having kind of more of this kind of moral approach. Okay? So the argument here, the approach here being that mental illnesses aren't caused by demonic possessions, but rather by stress and inhumane conditions. Okay, so stressors that people are experiencing, and that by being inhumane towards them, you're only making it worse. Okay, so Pinel said instead, hey, let's involve kind of moral treatment. Let's treat them with kindness, with gentleness. Let's encourage positive social interactions. Let's engage with them. And so the idea here is let's treat them with positivity and care and concern rather than physically harming them. Now, this was an effective approach because it got people to stop physically harming these mentally unstable individuals, but it didn't actually treat the mental illness itself. It only kind of treated the symptoms. And so this still kind of left everyone in this little bit of a lurch where they weren't quite sure how to help these individuals. Now, what ended up happening is psychologists started to develop this medical model. Okay, so this is our new slide here. And this medical model started to come from the fact that when syphilis occurred, they saw mental symptoms occurring, suggesting that these mental illness symptoms weren't a function of being a bad character, okay, or being demonically possessed, or something being wrong with their abilities, their a weak will or anything like that. They said, no, in fact, it's more biology-based. Okay, so this is where we start to see a little bit of this biopsychosocial approach coming in. And so we see that when researchers, when psychiatrists, psychologists, and the population as a whole starts to treat mental illness as more biology-based, we start to see some changes in the way we approach this. Okay? So psychological disorders can now be seen as kind of an illness of the mind, a psychopathology. Okay, so here we're saying is it's not about the person's character, but about some kind of illness that they're experiencing related to their neurological functioning, the way that the brain's functioning. And so with this, they start to say, well, let's take a medical approach to understanding psychological disorders, just like we do with physical disorders. Okay, so you go to the doctor's office, you start talking about kind of the different symptoms you have, and the doctor takes those symptoms and starts putting them together to then indicate what kind of illness you have. Okay, so we see that happening with the coronavirus. This idea here being that, you know, if you may potentially have it, here's the list of symptoms to look for. And so once people can be diagnosed, okay, as you guys were hinting at a bit before, we can start to provide treatment, okay, start to provide therapy with the goal of actually restoring that mental health. Okay, so we see quite a big swing happen in terms of the history of understanding and treating psychological disorders. We go from abusing people, trying to get demonic spirits out of them, to then treating them with kindness, okay, removing stress for them, trying to address those issues. But that really only treats kind of the person, the symptoms. It's now this medical model of saying, well, how do we get to the root cause of what's going on and improve the person's overall mental health? How do we make things better for that person? And so with that, we start to take, again, this biopsychosocial approach. So I won't belabor this point too much. But the idea here is we start to understand someone's psychological disorder by looking at their biology. Okay, so looking at their genes, maybe they have a genetic predisposition. Looking at their brain structure and chemistry, so getting into neurotransmitters. We'll talk quite a bit about that. We get into schizophrenia, we get into treatment. We look at psychological influences, such as the stressors they're experiencing, okay, the traumas that they're experiencing, maybe their mood, how they're feeling. And also we have the social cultural influences. So what's considered psychologically disordered? Okay, what defines then normal or disordered behavior? So all of this starts to kind of come together to develop this better approach that we now implement. Okay, so we go from harming others to this biopsychosocial approach, trying to have a very comprehensive understanding of what's going on for that particular individual. So let me pause here before we're going to get into talking about the diagnostic statistical manual. So kind of talking about how we diagnose these disorders in kind of more modern current times. Okay, so let me pause here, see what questions you have, if there's things that you want me to go back through. Okay, have a sip of my fake coffee here. Okay, so if you're good, let me know over chat. Say that you're good, just to make sure we're set with things. All right, appreciate the responses, appreciate you guys checking in. So let's address kind of how we think about things currently, where there's positives and negatives. Okay? So there's a lot of information on this particular slide, but again, you have the slides, don't stress about it too much. The idea here is thinking more about classifying psychological disorders. So not only can we talk about if someone has a psychological disorder or not, we can now get into talking about classifying them as a particular type that they have, particular type of psychological disorder. So we can start with kind of this broad question, why create classifications of mental illness? So what does this do about us? What's the value of talking about diagnoses instead of talking about individuals? Okay, so we can think about it, we can describe an individual set of symptoms, we can talk about a specific person, but what's the benefits of that compared to having a diagnosis? And there's several benefits that I think are worthwhile noting. So the first is that diagnoses create verbal shorthand for a list of associated symptoms. Okay, so when you have a cold, you tell someone else you have a cold. That person instantly knows by saying you have a cold that your nose is running, you're coughing, maybe your eyes are watering, maybe you're a little bit tired, feeling run down. By just saying you have a cold, you instantly kind of know the list of associated symptoms. Okay, so it makes it easier to communicate that information of what disorder you have, or illness as the example was, in terms of just kind of giving this shorthand. Another piece is that diagnoses allow us to statistically study similar cases. Okay, so by starting to lump things together a little bit by saying someone has a particular diagnosis and compare those to others with a diagnosis, okay, we start to learn the outcomes and start to predict what to do. Okay, so part of what's important for us with the coronavirus and diagnosing this is that this then allows us to have enough statistical cases to predict outcomes. Okay, so to know the mortality rate from this illness, to know the sequence of how the illness progresses, the best treatment for this. Okay, and that taps into one of the other reasons we want to have a diagnosis, is that it then guides the treatment choices. So what are some treatments that are available? Again, you go to the doctor, you give a list of symptoms, they say, it sounds like you have a really bad cold. Here's then the treatment options that you can have. Okay, here's ways that we can treat this. Okay. Now, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual is the guidebook that clinicians use, clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists use, to be able to provide these definitions, to classify if someone does have a mental illness and what type of mental illness it is. And so the idea behind the DSM is easier to count a case of autism, for instance, if we have a clear definition. So we start to look at just kind of this overall number of cases. We also see too, and this is one of the reasons that diagnoses came up, is that you can use it to justify payment for treatment, or in terms of court cases as well, we can use this to kind of talk about if the illness affected a person's judgment. It also creates a diagnosis used by medical doctors worldwide. So not only can you diagnose someone to help them, but you can start to make comparisons across disorders across the entire world. It allows doctors to then communicate with each other. Okay? So part of it too is that I can go to a different state, go to a different doctor, share my diagnosis, and instantly that doctor has a sense of what the symptoms are, what I'm dealing with. Now this sounds very positive and good, okay? But thinking about this, and I want you guys to evaluate it, what could be some criticisms of the DSM and having diagnoses for disorders? Okay, so where could the DSM be potentially more harmful to individuals they're diagnosing? And what could be some problems with having kind of these different criteria for disorders? Okay, so let's get some responses in terms of what are some limitations, what are some critiques of taking this approach with the DSM? Okay, so first response here, a great one. People may generalize your disorder based on label it's assigned. So you might see that when someone gets labeled, they may generalize all their behaviors to that particular disorder. Or you might see too that if others learn that someone has a disorder, they might start to interpret that person's behavior as being consistent with that disorder. Okay, so someone's diagnosed with depression, they might just be having a bad day similar to anyone else, but someone might evaluate that person as saying, oh, that's just characteristic of their depression. Okay, so great first response. Okay. Other potential critiques of using the DSM for diagnosis, okay, both in terms of using this approach, but also between categorizing different criteria as disorder or not.
People might start to judge you based on your disorder.
Okay, so unfortunately you start to lose that individual aspect of who you are, and rather you start to be seen kind of in terms of your diagnosis. I think that's a great response. And one of the downsides, one of the potential reasons why people don't seek treatment is because they don't want to let that happen. Okay, so great response. Okay. Other potential reasons, or other potential critiques, I should say. Okay, let's get one others, because there's a lot of critiques, there's a lot of evaluations. These are the kind of things you should think about because they impact kind of potential experiences you're going to have down the road as you interact with others. Maybe you're diagnosed yourself. So I'll share with you some of the critiques that others have had of the DSM. You may be thinking about these. The first is that the DSM is argued to call too many people disorder. So the idea is that they're saying too many people have could fall under some of these criteria and therefore be diagnosed as having a disorder. Relatedly, the border between diagnoses, between what seems normal disorder, also seems a bit arbitrary. Okay, so how do you truly interpret one symptom as fitting squarely with one type of disorder compared to another one? Okay, so this again might also be related to diagnosing too many people with disorders, because what is seen as disorder or not starts to become arbitrary. And this is something that you guys bumped up against a little bit with the vignettes and evaluating them if they have a disorder or not. We also see that decisions about what disorder seems to have a value judgment. Okay, so is depression necessarily deviant? We talked about that with Diane's situation. Well, you might say that everyone would kind of respond that way. So does she have a psychological disorder? Is it really a deviant behavior? As an example of this, the DSM in previous versions said that homosexuality was a disorder. Okay? That no longer is the case. So the idea there is that was there some type of value that changed between when it was first considered disordered compared to later? Or was it based on kind of scientific information and kind of learning in that regards? And one of the things you guys hinted at in your responses was that diagnostic labels direct us in terms of how we view and interpret the world. Okay, so telling us which behavior and mental states we see as disordered. That starts to influence then how people interact with someone who's given a disorder, a diagnosis of a disorder. Also, too, then that person that's been diagnosed starts to also maybe think about how they're interacting and their behaviors and how it may or may not be consistent with a diagnosis that they've received. So we start to see that diagnostic label can really change a person's perception, the perceptions of that person to other people's views. And that's why we might see that people are really hesitant to seek mental health treatment because they're afraid of the implications of that diagnosis. So let me pause here because we've now talked about how we treat psychological disorders in terms of labeling them, the kind of progression in terms of treatment. Before we begin talking about our first type of psychological disorders, let me see if there's any questions you guys have. Okay, and if you're all good over chat, let me know that that's the case before we'll spend the last 15 minutes working on mood disorders.